Welcome back to AP U.S. History. This is the Federalist Period, Part 3. We've talked about Hamilton's financial plan. We see the emergence of political parties, those who favor Jefferson's point of view and those who favor Hamilton's point of view. We said that Hamilton was pro-British. Jefferson was pro-French because he believed that they had supported us during the Revolutionary War. At this time, the French Revolution breaks out, which supports, in theory, democracy, citizen rights, part of the principles that come out of the Enlightened period. So he feels more of a kinship with the French. Now, under foreign policy, after the French Revolution, France and Great Britain will go to war. Washington is afraid that we should not be involved in foreign wars, and he's going to do all he can to keep us neutral. As far as the French Revolution was concerned, it was probably one of the biggest issues separating the Federalists and the Republican Democrats. Most Americans initially supported the revolution because it seemed to be fighting against monarchy, the aristocrats, the privileged. Of course, France proclaimed itself a republic similar to the U.S., and we see the French as brothers. The Reign of Terror, which takes place in France, is going to sour a lot of Americans because of the number of people who lost their heads and the anarchy and violence associated with the French Revolution. The guillotine is going to be the instrument of terror that the French Revolution is going to use to destroy the aristocrats and those who were against their revolution. No king, no religion, no God, no constitution. Essentially, it sort of depicts the French Revolution as a place where anarchy reigns, no government. Of course, it did have a government. Thousands of conservative and anti-revolutionaries executed in the French Revolution. Christianity abolished. Jeffersonians regretted that there was bloodshed, but felt it probably was inevitable anyway. Federalists were sort of frightened that it might spill over into America, and they want nothing to do with it. The French Revolution will become a world war. Great Britain will get sucked into the conflict. America must decide which side to support. Washington comes up with what he calls the Neutrality Proclamation in 1793. We still had a treaty with France saying that we were allies in the Franco-American Alliance signed in 1778. Under that alliance, we were obliged to agree to a peace, whatever end the war came to, both sides would agree to it, and we would protect the French West Indies from enemies. Jefferson favored this, the continuation of this alliance with France. President Washington believed that war should be avoided at all costs, and so he's going to rescind or go back on this proclamation or on the treaty. He believes that America is too militarily weak to fight anyone. And basically, this is one point that Hamilton and Jefferson agree on, that we're not prepared for war. And this was a proclamation. He didn't want us to get drawn into foreign wars, so we didn't take a side. We just stayed neutral. We would trade with both sides. So that's an important piece of foreign policy early on in the presidency. Under the proclamation, the U.S. would be neutral and wouldn't favor either side. He warned American citizens to be impartial for both countries. Of course, Jeffersonians were enraged that they hadn't been consulted. Jefferson denounces it. The Federalists in Congress support the action. Then there is a fellow named Citizen Genet who came to America as an ambassador to drum up support for the French Revolution. Eventually, Washington will demand his removal and tell him to go on home because he doesn't want the United States to be involved in that war. In spite of Washington's neutrality, this Citizen Genet tried to actively recruit support in the United States, but eventually he's sent home. He will actually meet with George Washington, and George Washington will say no thank you. Genet was instructed to use the United States as a base to equip privateers against the British, but the Americans under Washington are not going to have any part of that. Although there were some who did side with the French and will become privateers and attack British shipping. These were called privateers. America and France bid for the neutrality. That meant that it could supply foodstuff to the West Indies. France did not officially ask the U.S. to honor the Franco-American Treaty. If the U.S. had entered the war, British Navy certainly would have blockaded the U.S. and cut off the supplies for the French. Another piece of foreign policy that comes about is Jay's Treaty. It's an attempt to settle some disputes between the Americans and the British. Temporarily eased the U.S. and American tensions. There was problems in the West and the British seizing American ships. John Jay, who is going to be the first Supreme Court justice, is going to lead the negotiating team to Great Britain to work out some settlement between the British and the Americans. The treaty pretty much was not worth the paper it was written on because neither side will agree to anything that's written there. But the one thing that it did prevent was war immediately. So it's going to stave that off until 1812. So one of the significant outcomes of this treaty is that because the Jeffersonians hate the fact that the Americans are seen to be kowtowing to the British, the Democratic Republican Party is formed. Some of the background information, of course, the British did not vacate the forts in the West, and they encouraged Native Americans to attack settlers. Certainly this was a violation of the Peace Treaty of 1783, but the problem is that we have not honored the treaty either because we have not paid the Loyalists, nor have we paid the debts prior to the Revolutionary War to British merchants. So both sides are at fault. British sell arms and alcohol to the Indians to attack American settlers, which really peeves the Americans. The British Navy seized about 300 U.S. ships starting in 1793. Of course, this is a picture of the constant bickering between Americans and Native Americans, encouraged by the British government to attack settlers, American settlers. Seizing American ships and impressing sailors. That is, they accused sailors aboard American ships of being deserters from British ships, and so they would seize them and force them to work on British ships. The Federalists were unwilling to go to war with Great Britain, was another part of this. We depended on about 75% of the custom duties came from British imports, so that was a huge chunk of money to support the government. Jefferson argued that we should impose an embargo, just not trade with Great Britain, because of seizing our ships and also encouraging Native Americans to kill American settlers. Jefferson sent John Jay to negotiate the treaty. Um, Jeffersonians feared that the conservative Jay would sell out American interest, and after he came back, they pretty much believed that. Um, a treasonous, that could be considered treasonous, is that Hamilton gave all the bargaining positions of the Americans to the British, and this put us at a distinct disadvantage. Provisions. American won a few concessions. Uh, British renewed pledge to remove British ports or forts and posts from the American soil, but they really didn't. They said that they would pay for the damages and the cost of the seized ships, but they really didn't. And the British refused to guarantee against any future time seizure of American ships or impressment of their sailors, or inciting Indians to violence in the frontier. Of course, Americans were forced to pay the pre-Revolutionary War debts, but they didn't. Result: no one honored the agreement. So pretty much it was not worth the paper it was written on, but it did prevent war for a few years. Jefferson outraged, and Jeffersonians who agreed with him will form this party. The West felt betrayed because the Indian problem persisted. South felt the northern merchants would be paid damages, but they weren't going to receive payment for the cargo that had been seized. Southerners still believed that they were being taxed to pay for the revolutionary debts because most of whatever they sent out was agricultural goods, and there was no tariff on that, but there was certainly a tariff on goods coming to the Southerners, and they had to pay it. New England merchants still outraged that ships and sailors could be seized. War with Great Britain was averted, and the treaty was narrowly approved. Another important treaty that was signed was the Pinckney Treaty of 1795. This will normalize relationships with Spain. One of the reasons that Spain felt compelled to do this is they feared a British-American alliance against them. So they sought a way to make Americans their friends. Spain was declining in powers, and their position on the frontier was being weakened. As far as Spanish concessions, it granted free navigation of the Mississippi River, and you could deposit your goods in New Orleans. Pinckney made the deal. It was a good deal for the Americans, and now the people in the West will be able to use the Mississippi and ship their goods to other parts of the world instead of trying to take it across the mountains. Because of the Pinckney Treaty, the navigation of the Mississippi River basin will be all opened up to the Americans. And in 1795, you could deposit your goods in the port of New Orleans. And we'll stop there, and we'll pick up part 4 next time.